How were immigrants able to move to the US so freely in the 19s, but now immigrating from country to country is so difficult? The Chinese Exclusion Act changed everything. After that, US immigration laws continued to get more and more complicated and selective. Not every country has immigration laws that are as strict as the US. You need to do research to figure out the specifics for each country you're interested in. But yes, there are some countries you can pay for permanent residency. Immigration laws are a very new concept. They didn't exist prior to the mid-1800s and didn't become a fully standardized system until the early 19th. So prior to 150 years ago, you could go wherever you wanted freely with little to no one stopping you, assuming no bandits attacked you anyway. The difference is that it got a lot easier for immigrants to travel. In the earlier days of the country, you might be able to scrounge together enough for one passage to the Americas, and boats carrying passengers weren't all that common. So there were steady waves of people, but it was just really hard to travel over. By 1910 or so, massive steamships had become very common, and millions could get enough for a passage across. Disasters were few and far between, especially once radio allowed ships to warn each other. Plus, the sheer number of these ships grew and grew. It got a lot easier to travel to the New World. By the 1950s, it was just a matter of buying a flight and being here in one day. It gets easier and easier. It was less bureaucratic then, there were less rules and less checks. That's kinda it. A lot of places will let you pay for a work visa for a few years like the UK, but getting a job to sponsor you is easiest. The US immigration system was reformed in 1965 to allow people from all over the world to come in. With that came country caps. No more than 9,000 people from each country annually, approximately. Prior to that, there were no limits, but immigration was allowed only from the Western Hemisphere, their definition of the Western Hemisphere. The US had more restrictive immigration than Canada on a per capita basis. It always has. Just an FYI. Probably the rise in social benefits. There wasn't much loss to a country if people moved in. Now the cost of infrastructure, social benefits, etc. have increased dramatically. You can look at government spending as a percentage of GDP today compared to, say, 1875. It's gone up an order of magnitude from around 2-3 to around 25 today, just for the federal government. Not everything goes towards citizens, of course, but it gives you an idea. Their labor was needed, and for the most part, they were white. I wonder how much it has to do with labor laws. Seems that one major factor is that if you keep a major part of the workforce illegal, then you can exploit them with impunity. It's hard to overstate how big, and from there empty the US was prior to the closing of the American frontier in 1890 was. Prior to around 19, there was a strong demand for free labor all through the West, which made it fairly difficult to establish the kind of sedentary peasant class who you need to create the kind of oligarchic wealth you would see in, say, pre-revolutionary France. After all, why would you work 12 hours a day stirring molten slurry in a foundry if you could pack up and take a 4,000-acre farm in Montana for free? Again, from the POV of affluent Eurasian whites in 19th, the class interest of the oligarchs, the national security interests of the federal government, and the interest of the working classes were largely aligned in more immigration. After 19th, you didn't have that release valve and you started having immigrants who were effectively competing for jobs with the native working class, and no longer needed the population to fill out the empty bits for the feds, which broke down the consensus and set the stage for the Chinese Exclusion Act and assorted immigration restrictions. The US still takes more legal immigrants every year than any other country in the world. Less bureaucracy. I had a coworker who moved to Mexico. He said it wasn't all that difficult. Try there. Have you tried illegally entering Switzerland? No fences, but they keep illegals out by offering the benefits and a chance of work. It works. When my boomer siblings start spewing their foreigners need to come here the right way bullshit, I like to remind them that when our grandparents came here less than 100 years ago, all they had to do was get off the boat at Ellis Island, tell the authorities their names or whatever they wanted their names to be, and just like that, they were Americans. Those were entering legally through mechanisms that were in place at the time. They were required to have a sponsor, usually a family member or employer, who could ensure that the immigrant was going to be working. It wasn't. Immigrants were often just rounded up and driven out of the country with nothing to their names, even naturalized ones, or even ones born here. Oftentimes, they were just dumped in the desert to die, or just murdered or left to rot in prisons. The floodgates were open, so to speak, so folks could just come and go more easily. However, it doesn't mean the government tolerated them. Operation Wetback was a thing that happened, and that was literally its name. As much as conservatives scream about history and tradition, the doctrine of limited immigration was invented out of whole cloth after the country was over a century old. I have relatives who came to America through Ellis Island in the early 19s from Russia and Holland. They had to be sponsored by someone who already lived here, and that person had to ensure the incoming person had a job. Later, they took a citizenship test. It wasn't so easy. Both have plaques on Ellis Island. They did not just get off a ship and assimilate. They used to come, register, work, and pay taxes. Now they come anonymously, work under the table for a fraction of what actual citizens earn, and use our medical and welfare social services.